I'm, excuse me, I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. Messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for November the 24th, 2025. We've got a lot to cover today. As I announced at the end of our episode on Friday, we should be having a 3-part series, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and we're going to be going through Yeshua as Lord of the Sabbath. And that just seemed to be an appropriate continuation of how, at the end of last week, we discussed the 4th commandment. Before we get started, because this is Monday, if you have not already, please do visit MessianicApologetics.net. Here in the right-hand column, you see blog notifications. Be automatically notified by email when Messianic Apologetics is updated. So you can put your email address in that. You'll be asked to confirm, and you'll receive an automatic notification when we add something new or reintroduce something from our archives. That's different from the email announcement list via Constant Contact, which you can subscribe to by clicking on the envelope icon in the upper right-hand corner. All right, and because we are approaching the winter holidays in the month of December, I want to reference the Messianic Winter Holiday Helper we have. This is one of our major ministry resources. It's available in both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle. You can look it up at outreachisraelbookstore.com. All right. In addition to having to clear my throat before getting started, I'm sorry about that. We also have another correction to issue. This is from last week on Friday. The scene with someone dressed up as Trump, Netanyahu, Biden, Antony Blinken, and Marco Rubio, that was at Union Station in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, it's a huge problem. A lot of people are having to sort through right now, but wanted to make that correction. All right. And as we get this week started, I know that many of us here in the United States were looking forward to the Thanksgiving holiday, excuse me, on Thursday. Like many of you, we've got a lot of family we're going to be entertaining, so we will not have Messianic Insider on Thursday or Friday, but probably by the weekend, you can expect me to do a McKee Moment post. So that's why we've got this 3-part series, Yeshua as Lord of the Sabbath. All right, let's get started on our theology roundup. This teaching has been taken from our updated Messianic Sabbath Helper publication. This is something you can look up at outreachisraelbookstore.com. It is a major resource, a wide breadth of material addressing a wide array of topics associated with Shabbat. This publication has been divided up into 2 main parts: the significance of Shabbat and a theology of Shabbat, which of course involves things like, did Yeshua break the Sabbath? What does it mean for Yeshua to be Lord of the Sabbath? So we're going to switch windows really quickly and get into our teaching. All right, there we go. So over the next 3 days, we will be discussing Mark 2, 23 to 28. That's for today. And then later, Matthew 12, 1 through 8, Luke 6, 1 through 5. The Son of Man as Lord of the Sabbath. All 3 of the synoptic gospels record a scene of Yeshua the Messiah and his disciples walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Mark 2, 23 to 28, Matthew 12, 1 through 8, Luke 6, 1 through 5. And with Yeshua being criticized for permitting his disciples to conduct some kind of traditionally unauthorized Sabbath activity. While each of the gospel records incorporates a slightly different account of the events, and as such includes some varied details, in our evaluation of the seventh-day Sabbath from the apostolic scriptures, our focus will mainly be on what different examiners and interpreters on Mark, Matthew, and Luke separately have said about the Messiah's observance of Shabbat. Did Yeshua promote Sabbath violation? Did the actions of Yeshua convey the intention of the Sabbath institution being abolished in the future? Or did Yeshua's views in this scene sit within normative Jewish practice? All right, so our passage today, Mark 2, 23 to 28. And it happened that as he was going on the Sabbath, Shabbat, through the grain fields, and his disciples began, as they went, to pluck the heads of grain. Deuteronomy 23, 25. The Pharisees said to him, Behold, why do they do that which is not permitted on the Sabbath, Shabbat? He said to them, Did you never read what David did when he had need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered into God's house at the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not permitted to eat except for the priests, and gave it also to those who were with him. Leviticus 24:9, 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6, 2 Samuel 15:35. He said to them, The Sabbath, Shabbat, was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath, Shabbat. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 10, Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 14. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, Shabbat. Mark 2, 23 to 28, Messianic Apologetics Revised Version, which is just my edited version of the public domain World Messianic Bible, formerly the Hebrew Names Version. Some of you are probably familiar with that. Mark 2:23. This scene opens with the narration. Now it happened on Shabbat that Yeshua was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way plucking the heads of grain. Mark 2:23, Tree of Life version. While accusations would be principally directed toward Yeshua as the behavior of his disciples reflected back on him as their teacher, it was mainly the disciples who were actually doing something which could have been constituted as some violation of the Sabbath. The disciples were traveling on the Sabbath and as such may have exceeded some of the normative distance allowed for walking, Acts 1:12. But the issue which actually gains attention was how in walking through grain or wheat fields, the disciples were plucking off the heads of grain, rubbing them with their hands and fingers, and then eating them. Gleaning from the fields is something which is actually permitted in the Torah. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. Deuteronomy 23:25, World Messianic Bible. Mark 2:24. Various Pharisees, looking at what was taking place, as it appears in most English Bibles, exclaimed, Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Mark 2:24, New American Standard. Or, look, why are they violating Shabbat? Complete Jewish Bible. The challenge with this rendering is that the verb ex esti more properly means it is allowed, it is in one's power, it is possible. Liddell Scott, notably lacking the root nomos or law. A much better rendering would be along the lines of, look at what they are doing on the Sabbath. That is not allowed. Moffat New Testament. Look at that. Why should they do what is forbidden on the Sabbath day? Phillips New Testament. Or, look, why are they doing what is not permitted on Shabbat? Tree of Life version. Whether or not a specific violation of the Torah or law of Moses was actually taking place is something which Christian readers do not often weigh, but Messianic readers do tend to weigh. Plucking heads of grain in one's hand could have been taken as a kind of harvesting, and Exodus 34:21 does explicitly prohibit harvesting on the Sabbath. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. World Messianic Bible. At the same time, the harvesting in view is a major agricultural chore, which the disciples were not engaging in. More customarily, examiners will reference the 39 classifications of prohibited work in the Mishnah, which would include reaps, threshes, and grinds. Mishnah Shabbat 7:2, all of which the disciples could have been accused of doing by rubbing heads of grain with their hands and fingers. William L. Lane properly directs how the Pharisees looking on, quote, raise a question of halakha, of what is legally permitted or prohibited, unquote. R.T. France further indicates, quote, there is no indication that Jesus either rejected the Sabbath law as such or questioned that the Sabbath was intended as a day of cessation from work, but his understanding of what was and was not permissible did not coincide with current interpretation, and yet was asserted with a sovereign assurance which raised sharply the issue of halakhic authority, unquote. It is to be properly recognized that when the accusation was issued, why are your disciples picking grain on the Sabbath? They are not supposed to do that. Contemporary English version, that the discussion which would ensue would regard what was and what was not permitted to take place on Shabbat. That some Jewish authorities from the Second Temple period held to a more strict and rigid view of Shabbat than others is well known. The institution and value of the Sabbath itself, though, was not in question in Mark 2:23-28. As Robert A. Gulick summarizes, quote, the Pharisee and rabbinic tradition was vitally concerned with delineating what could and could not be done as seen in the listing of the 39 proscribed major works in Mishnah Shabbat 7:2 that were later broken down into 6 subcategories each and a further list in Mishnah Beitza 5:2. This specification of proscribed activities reflects their concern to avoid all possibilities of transgressing the Sabbath law. Only life-threatening situations or dire personal needs could supersede the Sabbath law, unquote. The actions of Yeshua's disciples in plucking heads of grain and eating them on Shabbat would be seen to be rightfully placed within the context of eating food for sustenance. However, it would also be seen that Yeshua's unique authority and position, Mark 2:28, which makes him anything but a normal human teacher or rabbi, is what would ultimately allow both him and his followers to push some of the Sabbath stipulations in view of the overarching importance of their mission. Mark 2:25-26. Yeshua made light of a scene from the Tanakh in order to legitimize the actions of his disciples in plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. And he said to them, haven't you ever read what David did when he was in need and he and those with him became hungry? How he entered into the house of God when Abiathar was Kohen Gadol, high priest, and ate the showbread, which is permitted only for the Kohanim, priests, to eat, and gave some even to those who were with him. Mark 2, 25-26, Tree of Life version. David and his companions were fleeing for their lives, hungry and starved, and the only food they could quickly eat was the consecrated bread of the tabernacle, intended only for the Levitical priests to eat. Leviticus 24, 5-9. This scene is recorded in 1 Samuel 21, 1-6. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone and no man with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commanded me to do something and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the business about which I send you and what I have commanded you. I have sent the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what is under your hand? Please give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever is available." Excuse me. The priest answered David and said, "I have no common bread, but there is holy bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest and said to him, "Truly, women have been kept from us as usual these 3 days. When I came out, the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was only a common journey. How much more then today shall their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to be replaced with hot bread in the day when it was taken away. 1 Samuel 21, 1-6, World Messianic Bible. When turning to 1 Samuel 21, 1-6, from Mark 2, 25, an issue does jump out at readers, as it concerns how Ahimelech was actually noted to be the high priest here and not Abiathar, who was actually the son of Ahimelech. 1 Samuel 22:20. The New International Version offers a way around this, with the slight paraphrase, "In the days of Abiathar the high priest." A variety of thoughts have been offered as to why Mark 2:25 references Abiathar and not Ahimelech. Lane notes the view that Abiathar was referenced and not Ahimelech because he was a more widely known figure. Quote, "Abiathar was a son of Ahimelech who escaped the massacre of the high priestly family and who enters the record for the first time a chapter later, 1 Samuel 22:20. Because he served as high priest and was better known in association with David than his father, it is commonly assumed a primitive error entered the tradition before it came into Mark's hands, or an early marginal gloss which was an error moved into the text. The difficulty was early felt and is reflected in the manuscript tradition. In chapter 226, Mark may have inserted the reference to Abiathar to indicate the section of the Samuel scroll in which the incident could be located. Unquote. It cannot go overlooked how the Tanakh itself is not entirely clear about either Ahimelech or Abiathar. 1 Samuel 22:20 describes how one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. World Messianic Bible. But then later in 2 Samuel 8:17, it is stated Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests. Seraiah was scribe. World Messianic Bible. Also, in 1 Chronicles 18:16, it is described Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Abimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests. Shavsha was scribe. World Messianic Bible. With it further recorded in 1 Chronicles 24:6, Shemaiah, the son of Nethanel, the scribe, who was of the Levites, wrote them in the presence of the king, the princes, Zadok the priest, Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar. World Messianic Bible. James R. Edwards concurs how there is some ancient confusion about Ahimelech and Abiathar. Quote, Already in the Old Testament, Abiathar and Ahimelech appear to be confused. In 1 Samuel 22:20, Ahimelech is said to be the son of Ahitub and the father of Abiathar. But in 2 Samuel 8:17 and 1 Chronicles 18:16, Zadok is said to be the son of Ahitub and Ahimelech the son of Abiathar. 1 Chronicles 24:6 also calls Ahimelech the son of Abiathar. The family genealogy is ostensibly Ahitub, father of Ahimelech, father of Abiathar, father of Ahimelech. 1 Chronicles 24:3, 6:31. There appear to be two Ahimelechs, grandfather and grandson, with Abiathar between, but as noted, the second and third members of the line are sometimes reversed. Abiathar is by all accounts the dominant member of the genealogy, since he survived the massacre of his father by Doeg and fled to David. Unquote. If there was any confusion in Mark 2:25 referencing Abiathar and not Ahimelech, then it needs to be recognized how John Mark was only passing on a potentially older historical issue from Samuel and Chronicles. The more significant issue in referencing how the future King David and his men would eat the bread of the presence, which they technically were prohibited from consuming, is how they were not condemned for it. C.E.B. Cranfield states, quote, "The drift of the argument is the fact that Scripture does not condemn David for his action, shows that the rigidity with which the Pharisees interpreted the ritual law was not in accordance with Scripture, and so was not a proper understanding of the law itself." Unquote. If David and his party could eat forbidden bread from the tabernacle, then what about Yeshua's followers gleaning from the field on Shabbat? There are likely to be some points of agreement and disagreement, which today's Messianic readers will have with the thoughts of D. Thomas Lancaster in his 2013 book, The Sabbath Breaker, Jesus of Nazareth and the Gospel's Sabbath Conflicts, where he says, quote, "The Master admitted that David and his companions did something which is not lawful when they took and ate the holy bread. In saying this, he conceded, by way of comparison, that his disciples also did something which is not lawful on the Sabbath. David and his men correspond to the disciples. Both parties were hungry and without food. Both parties acquired food by forbidden means. David violated the ritual sanctity of the temple service by taking and eating the bread of the presence. The disciples violated the sanctity of the Sabbath by plucking, husking, and eating grain on the Sabbath day. David violated the sanctity of the temple service because he was hungry, as were those who were with him. Jesus justified David on the basis that he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him. Mark 2:25. Jesus reasoned that the need and hunger of David and his men provided them with adequate reason for violating the ritual sanctity of the temple service by eating the bread of the presence." Unquote. Once again from his book, The Sabbath Breaker. Lancaster will go on in his resource and make an appeal to the rabbinic principle of pikuach nefesh, or regard for human life, in that any ritual commandment can be violated in order to preserve human life. Hence, what both David and Yeshua's disciples did was not strictly wrong. Some will balk at picking heads of grain and rubbing them with one's hands and fingers as being a violation of Pentateuchal Sabbath instructions, as Lancaster is upholding the 39 classifications of work in the Mishnah by his remarks. Mishnah Shabbat 7:2, stipulations to be ignored apparently when severe hunger sets in. It is probably fair to recognize that the disciples' perceived violation of the Sabbath by some Pharisees looking on was not a strict violation of the Sabbath, as they were hungry, and the principle of pikuach nefesh can indeed apply. And in this case, they were gleaning from a field, Deuteronomy 23:25, as opposed to the more serious eating the bread of the presence. There are various Christian commentators who would disagree, though, that the preservation of life via cessation of hunger was the issue here. A number of commentators on Mark think that an appeal to the example of David is instead what needs to be probed. And this is hardly without merit in the view of Edwards. Quote, David had eaten the consecrated bread as an exception when he and his men were starving. Jesus, however, does not raise the incident in order to plead for a Sabbath exception for his hungry disciples. He cites David's violation of the Torah not as an excuse for his action, but as a precedent, unquote. He further indicates, quote, in making the allusion to David, Jesus is inviting comparison between his person and Israel's royal messianic prototype, unquote. Mark 10:47, 12:35 to 37. Larry W. Hurtado draws out how the incident with David was not normative, but rather was necessary per the needs of the moment, apparently in light of him being the future monarch of Israel. In a similar manner, Yeshua's mission of declaring the good news of his Father's kingdom could very well override some of the more normative practices witnessed on the Sabbath. Quote, in the context, David's breach of the religious rules was necessitated by the urgent situation, and Jesus is saying that the urgency of his mission demands that he too must violate religious custom by traveling and foraging even on the Sabbath. The point is that the actions of Jesus and his disciples are closely connected with their mission, and the analogy with David is one of situation and not exact conduct. This, however, means that the issue boils down to the question of whether, in fact, Jesus' message and mission came before the observance of such an important commandment as Sabbath, unquote. Gulick offers the general thought, quote, just as David had the authority and freedom to eat illegally and to give those with him to eat the showbread illegally, so Jesus had the authority and freedom to permit his disciples who had left all to follow him. Matthew 19:27, to eat food gathered illegally on the Sabbath, unquote. France is more forthright, noting how the association with the future King David's actions reveal a personal identity on the part of the Messiah, at least on par with one of ancient Israel's heroes. Quote, the question is not in any way whether the specific action could or could not be declared legitimate. It was rather, as verses 27 and 28 will make clear, whether Jesus had the right to override the agreed conventions in his capacity as kurios to sabbatu. The focus of the scriptural allusion is not therefore so much on what David did as on the fact that it was David who did it, and that scripture records his act, illegal as it was, with apparent approval. The logic of Jesus' argument, therefore, implies a covert claim to a personal authority, at least as great as that of David, unquote. Perhaps indeed the disciples had a bout of hunger in their Sabbath activities, and the rabbinic principle of pikuach nefesh, or regard for human life, would have permitted their plucking heads of grain. But Yeshua did not tell his detractors they were famished and needed to eat, which might have immediately shut them down. Instead, Yeshua associated the activities of his party with the activities of a prior monarch of Israel, who ate the bread of the presence without condemnation. Yeshua, as the Messiah, King, and Savior of Israel, was out to perform even more important actions than David. Mark 2:27. One of the most frequently quoted statements by people across the theological spectrum regarding the Messiah's approach to the institution of the Sabbath is his famed word, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27, New American Standard. A frequent conclusion drawn, recognized by Edwards, is how, quote, 227 clarifies the relationship between human life and the Sabbath. People are not made for Sabbath rules, but the Sabbath was instituted to bless humanity and enhance its well-being, unquote. It tends to be further thought that by these words, the Lord was making an appeal to the creation function of Shabbat, Genesis 2, 1 through 3, and how the Sabbath rest is ultimately to be liberating to people, not restrictive. And it is witnessed how there are similar statements phrased in the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and Talmud. But the Lord did not choose the nation for the sake of the holy place, but the place for the sake of the nation. 2 Maccabees 5:19, Revised Standard Version. And you said that you would make a man for this world as a guardian over your works, that it should be known that he was not created for the world, but the world for him. 2 Baruch 14:17. Rabbi Yosef ben Rabbi Judah says, only you shall keep my Sabbaths, Exodus 31:13. Might one suppose that this is under all circumstances? Scripture says only, meaning there can be exceptions. Rabbi Jonathan ben Joseph says, for it is holy to you. It is given into your hands. You are not committed into its hands. Talmud Yoma 85b. The Sabbath, as great and important as a gift that it is, as the New Living Translation paraphrases Mark 2:27, was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. Are there exceptions to the rules and stipulations of the Sabbath or Shabbat, be those rules found in the traditional Jewish halakha or even in the Mosaic Torah proper? Yes. Much discussion can surround the assertion of Mark 2:27, ta sabbaton dia ton anthropon agenata. There was certainly some difference of opinion in Second Temple Judaism regarding whether the seventh-day Sabbath or Shabbat was only intended for Israel proper, Jubilees 2, 19 through 21, 31, or as something which was actually intended for all of humanity. Philo on the Decalogue 97 and 98, on the Creation 89. There is not always agreement within our contemporary Messianic movement on this either. Still, there are many within our faith community who do favor that Mark 2:27 be rendered as Shabbat was made for mankind, not mankind for Shabbat. Complete Jewish Bible. With the Sabbath being an inclusive rather than an exclusive institution for all people, even with a number of limitations. And we've got some previous discussions on Genesis 2, 1 through 3, Exodus 20, 8 through 11, Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15. These two we went through last week. Lancaster is broadly favorable toward non-Jewish believers keeping the seventh-day Sabbath along with Jewish believers. Quote, when Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, his statement includes all human beings, not just Jews. This is not the same as saying that all human beings are obligated to keep the Sabbath in the same manner as the Jewish people. It only means that the Sabbath is God's gift to human beings. It is his blessed and holy day. He did not institute the Sabbath at Mount Sinai. He instituted it immediately after the sixth day of creation, which is to say immediately after the creation of the first human beings. A non-Jewish disciple of Jesus does not have the same covenantal obligation to keep the Sabbath that a Jewish person has. Nevertheless, he has the privilege of enjoying the Sabbath, celebrating the Sabbath, and even keeping it to whatever extent he is able. According to our teacher Jesus, the Sabbath was made for everyone, unquote, from the Sabbath Breaker. In this writer's view, my view, while Shabbat should be viewed as a creation ordinance which affects all human beings, the differences between Jewish and non-Jewish people with their Sabbath keeping is likely going to be more in terms of how much or how little of Jewish tradition they employ in their observance of it. Not all people, for example, may make the effort of having a Shabbat dinner on Friday evening, as beneficial and edifying a custom that may be. Likewise, to a Jewish person, Shabbat is a part of his or her ethnic and cultural heritage, whereas a non-Jewish follower of Israel's Messiah has only inherited Shabbat as a part of his or her spiritual heritage in Israel's scriptures. While many of today's Messianic people might be a bit perturbed that the Sabbath was made for mankind and mankind for the Sabbath, does not appear in more of the English Bibles with which they are familiar. For Mark 2:27, it cannot go unnoticed how versions employing a philosophy of inclusive language, actually going back to the 1989 New Revised Standard Version, have gone even further than this. For Mark 2:27. So here are a number of versions to keep in mind here. The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. New Revised Standard. The Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. Kingdom New Testament. The Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. Common English Bible. But what does the emphasis upon the human beings who have received the institution of the Sabbath mean for the conflict of Yeshua's disciples plucking heads of grain to avert hunger? Gulick draws the conclusion that, quote, either we have a saying that affirms the human freedom to set aside the Sabbath law without any qualifications, or we have a saying that affirms the value of the Sabbath as God's provision at creation, but as a benefit for man, the human creature, with no prescribed or proscribed guidelines for Sabbath conflict, unquote. Those Messiah followers who want to view the Sabbath as an institution for the benefit of all humankind recognize its potential to provide a weekly period of rest and refreshment for all, and hence would not be too keen to just cast aside the Torah and Tanakh stipulations for what it means to rest from one's labor and abstain from commerce. They would not see various prescribed or proscribed guidelines for the Sabbath as being incompatible with the benefits of rest and refreshment. Shabbat is to be an institution to be honored with the example of the ministry and activities of Yeshua the Messiah in focus. This would mean that the application of various Sabbath injunctions, be they biblical or extra-biblical, does need to fall within the purview of what the Messiah would do. All right, and the last verse, Mark 2:28. The mark and scene of Yeshua's disciples plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath ends with the Messiah asserting, so the Son of Man is Lord even of Shabbat. Mark 2:28, Tree of Life version. Mark 2:28 is most often interpreted in association with the Daniel 7:13 through 14 theophany of one like a Son of Man being given full dominion and power, sitting alongside the Lord God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh himself, and receiving the same worship and honor. In Yeshua the Messiah, asserting such a status as the Son of Man, he has sovereignty over the Sabbath, similar to how earlier in Mark 2:10, readers encounter, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. World Messianic Bible. What Yeshua's sovereignty over the Sabbath as the Son of Man would mean is that he gets to determine what can and cannot be done on Shabbat. Lane indicates, quote, reflection on Jesus' act and word through which he established the true intention of the Sabbath and exposed the weakness of a human system offensing the law with restrictions, revealed his sovereign authority over the Sabbath itself, unquote. Hurtado makes the astute point, quote, by virtue of Jesus' authority and the urgency of his mission, he is presented as free to judge how to employ even the Sabbath day in the pursuit of his task, in which he heralds the arrival of the ultimate good for humanity, symbolized in the gift of the Sabbath rest, unquote. Contrasting this may be the thought of R. Alan Cole. Quote, he claims to have the absolute right to overrule the Sabbath, unquote. Something which need not be overlooked at all when it comes to people considering the supreme example of the Messiah in keeping the Sabbath is how in the Tanakh or Old Testament, Shabbat was an institution regarded as being of or to the Lord, or Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Exodus 16:25, 20 verse 10, Deuteronomy 5:14, also Exodus 31:13, Leviticus 19:3, 30, Ezekiel 20 verses 12 through 13. But here, it is Yeshua who is the Lord of the Sabbath. France stresses how Yeshua being the Lord of the Sabbath has important Christological dimensions to it, obviously pointing in the direction of Yeshua being divine. Quote, here the concept represents yet another escalation in the unique exousia, that's authority, exercised by Jesus. He is being progressively revealed as kurios, meaning Lord, in his teaching and action, in relation to spiritual powers and physical illness, in the declaration of the forgiveness of sins, and even in relation to that most sacred of divine institutions, the Sabbath. The Christological stakes could hardly be pitched higher than this, unquote. Not all examiners are in fact agreed that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath involves the Messiah's divine authority to determine what is and what is proper to do on Shabbat. An alternative approach, sometimes witnessed, is that the terminology Son of Man is not to be taken as a divine title or messianic title, but instead, via a background of the Aramaic, Bar Nashah is more akin to the generic human being. Hence, Mark 2:28 would instead mean that the human being is Lord/Master, even of the Sabbath, in the sense that people do what they need to do on the Sabbath. Cranfield explains one of the major reasons for why this alternative approach is adopted by various examiners, in how, quote, if the term Son of Man was a recognizable messianic title, would Jesus have used it thus openly at this stage of his ministry and in conversation with his opponents, unquote. Would the Son of Man have been a title used early on in the Messiah's ministry? Some do not think so, but the presence of the title Son of Man earlier in Mark 2:10 should cause many to disregard the human being view of Mark 2:28. Although many commentators on Mark rightly hold to Mark 2:28 pertaining to Yeshua the Messiah as the Son of Man and Lord of the Sabbath, having ultimate authority on what can and cannot be done on the Sabbath, application of this can, for sure, be taken beyond the Messiah having a final authority on Sabbath halakha and praxis. C.E. Graham Swift is one who thinks, quote, the Sabbath has been given for man's benefit. Therefore, the representative man may decide how it can best be used. Under his influence, it has been changed to another day of the week and made available to all nations. We disregard it to our loss and peril, unquote. Messianic people who affirm the Messiah's supremacy over all things, as Lord no less, would agree with Swift, with the Messiah having final authority over how the Sabbath can best be used, as well as how those people, Jewish or non-Jewish, who disregard the Sabbath, do so to their own loss of blessing and revitalization. But whether Yeshua actually had an intention on changing the Sabbath to another day of the week is something to be evaluated from further passages to be sure, i.e. Mark 16:1, Matthew 28:1, Luke 24:1, Acts 20 verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, which of course we've all evaluated in the Messianic Sabbath Helper. Ben Witherington III, who is certainly one who does not believe in the post-resurrection era validity of either the seventh-day Sabbath or the Torah, is notably ambiguous in his conclusion. Quote, Jesus understands the original intention of the Sabbath and is bringing that into focus, providing true rest and restoration for his disciples. He has the power and authority to declare that the old ways are no longer applicable in view of the inbreaking eschatological action of God. Unquote. Reasonable Messianic people, who once again would affirm the Messiah's supremacy over all things, should recognize how he has the authority to declare that the old ways are no longer applicable in view of the inbreaking eschatological action of God. But do such old ways involve the institution of the seventh-day Sabbath itself? Or are they just to be limited to how Shabbat is observed in light of his kingdom proclamation? Taking a rather gospel-critical approach to the passage of Mark 2, 23-28, Gulick, not quite knowing what to believe, can only conclude, quote, neither Jesus nor his disciples' lifestyle, as best we can tell, indicate a penchant for abrogating the law, nor does the Sabbath practice of the primitive church, limited though our knowledge may be, indicate a cavalier approach to the Sabbath. Consequently, we do not have any basis for considering Jesus to have annulled, in principle, the Sabbath law for himself or his followers. Unquote. We should welcome such a conclusion because throughout the scene of his disciples picking the heads of grain, the issue was actually Sabbath halakha. There was no issue as to the ongoing importance or validity of the Sabbath, given Yeshua's assertion about Shabbat being a gift for humanity, Mark 2:27. Edwards usefully mentions some of the broader issues present in Mark 2:27 and 28, which today's Messiah-centric and Messiah-focused Messianic people should appreciate. He details how throughout Christian history, there needs to be a balance sought between the place of God's law and the will of God as demonstrated in the example of Yeshua. Certainly in Protestant history, various piety movements which have emphasized the importance of what they at least consider the so-called moral law of the Torah and a quote-unquote Sunday Sabbath have had to balance these factors together. Quote, 2:27 and 28 preserve an important clue concerning the relationship of Jesus and the Torah, gospel and law, which have long been a point of controversy in Christianity. The extremes of both legalism and antinomianism are avoided. The law is not here regarded as an autonomous revelation, which in legalism tends to replace the person of God. Nor is Jesus a free agent who abrogates the Sabbath or the moral order or the revealed will of God, as in antinomianism. Rather, the sayings of verses 27 and 28 teach that the righteous purpose of God, as manifested in the Torah, can be recovered and fulfilled only in relation to Jesus, who is its Lord. Unquote. Today's Messianic people who believe in the post-resurrection era validity of the seventh-day Sabbath can take a cue from this. As beneficial and rewarding as keeping Shabbat might be, how valuable is our Sabbath keeping if it is not remembered in light of the ministry and service of Yeshua the Messiah? He is the one who performed important and critical actions on the Sabbath precisely because he was the King of Israel. And so, in spite of the varied views and historical probing seen in his World Biblical Commentary volume, the overall conclusion presented by Gulick is one with which many of us would agree. Quote, in light of Genesis 1 and the order of creation, Jesus claimed the authority to do God's work of the age of salvation, see 3:1-5, and to provide for his own, 2:23-26, in conjunction with his ministry, even when such actions came into conflict with the Sabbath law. He was not annulling the Sabbath law in principle. Rather, he was interpreting the Sabbath law in the light of his ministry, unquote. Each of us who has experienced the goodness of Yeshua's salvation believes that we need to make Yeshua the Lord or Master of our lives. When we can recognize him as being the Lord of the Sabbath or Shabbat, then what we do on the seventh day is to be in alignment with what he would do. Far from such actions being seen as a nullification of the Sabbath, they are to be seen as a reinforcement of it, as a venue to provide men and women, all human beings, with a specific day when they can consider how well they are accomplishing the mission of the Creator God in the earth. All right, and that concludes part one, our analysis of Mark 2, 23 to 28. Tomorrow we'll be continuing with part two, Yeshua as Lord of the Sabbath, with Matthew 12, 1 through 8. All right, now we need to switch screens back. There we go. And once again, this teaching has been taken from our ministry's Messianic Sabbath Helper publication. All right, so let's continue in our stream for today with our news roundup. Now, we go through the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is, of course, time sensitive and it changes from day to day. We are reminded, number one, to be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And number three, be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front. Because right now there are a lot of things which, of course, can have us be very, very concerned, very, very worried. We, as the people of God who have the salvation of Yeshua, who, as we just noted, is the Lord of the Sabbath. So it not only involves that what he did on the Sabbath is to be an example for us, but he ultimately provides the extreme rest and comfort which the Sabbath is to portray. So with that, we are to be able vessels of God's grace, mercy, comfort, solace, reason, of course, sanity, as things get increasingly more complicated. Because we do have a number of things to go through from the weekend where it's like, are things going to get any better, right? So all the news stories I'm about to go through, these are things which I mostly encounter passively on social media. And there are probably some other things which have happened right before we went live, during when we went live. But all the links will be available for you to look at later today when this episode is archived at MessianicApologetics.net. So you can go read the different articles, watch the different news clips, etc. All right, our first story, and this is from the scene which erupted at Union Station in Washington, D.C. There's a 54-second clip. This is often being considered in Jewish sectors right now as a blood libel. It does upset me that it's not getting more circulation in the Messianic community, although I did forward it on to my local Messianic rabbi. Eitan Fishberger, this is from November the 20th, so it's a few days ago, said this: 2 years ago, something like this would have been a national scandal. But now, question mark, it barely registers on social media. Anti-Semitism and the Intifada have been globalized and normalized. Shameful. Now, what we need to think about is how 2020's America is not 1930s Germany. We do have social media. Unlike German culture, I mean, there's a lot of respect to people from Germany, Austria who watch, listen to this, did have a social apathy toward Judaism, unlike the United States, which is largely a country of immigrants. It's much more Protestant, and we expect, people from all over the world to come to America and to make the most of their lives. So we don't have some of the anti-Semitic currents in our society the same way as the old world did. But that doesn't mean we don't need to guard against anti-Semitism, social anti-Semitism, or other violent acts. So because of social media, because there are a lot of Christian supporters of Israel, there's going to be like a push and pull. And I think anti-Semitism, as we get closer to Yeshua's return, is going to go in waves here in America. There's going to be pushback against something like this. But we do need to take note of it. We can't be ignoring it. And if you have a Messianic congregation or synagogue, you need to be monitoring this stuff, and you need to tell people about it. Don't hold it back. Because if you hold it back, then what are you doing when there is likely to be some nasty incident and something really bad takes place? Rather, you need to be able to tell people, look, we know what's going on. We're praying against it. We're taking the appropriate actions, and we're guarding our assembly in case anything wrong happens. But you need to know about this because we are part of the end time move of God, and this is the kind of road sign we look for. Okay, to the Western Hemisphere. This is from Open Source Intel, November the 21st. So yes, this was from Friday afternoon. The United States has issued a new NOTAM for the entire Venezuelan flight information region, advising of a hazardous security environment amid worsening conditions and heightened military activity in and around Venezuela. Yeah, we're still waiting to see what's going to come of the Venezuelan situation. We got some more on that later on. All right, our next story, and this is also Open Source Intel, November the 21st. 15-second clip. This is from the Park East Synagogue. Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York, attacked the synagogue for hosting a Nefesh B'Nefesh event as breaching international law, while completely ignoring the protesters outside who are calling for intifada and resistance. You can't make this up. So Open Source Intel, which is mainly a Jewish source of news, by the way, it's going to take notice of these kinds of things, and rightfully so. And as I said, if you're in a Messianic congregation, you need to be pointing these things out to your congregational members, because it's, we're living in some very, very dark times, and we need not be caught unaware. Okay, Open Source Intel passed this along on Friday afternoon, 2:44 p.m., 1 minute, 10 seconds. U.S. President Donald Trump on New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani. I think you're going to have, hopefully, a really great mayor. The better he does, the happier I am, I will say. Now, there are a lot of questions about why did President Trump meet with Mamdani at the Oval Office? Why did Mamdani meet with President Trump at the Oval Office? Obviously, they need to interact. Some people believe that Trump is playing a long game politically, and Mamdani is ultimately going to find himself screwing up and then somehow in the political crosshairs. I don't know. Obviously, Donald Trump, as a native New Yorker, wants New York to be a good place for people to come and live and do business. I completely understand that, but we'll see. All right, back to what occurred. Union Station, Washington, D.C. This is from November the 21st. Watch. This is what happens when you brainwash people daily to hate Jews. This is the D.C. Union Station, vile and disgusting. USA 2025, not 1938 Germany. Now, are we at a point of no return in America where anti-Semitism acts like this? It's just going to continue on unabated? I don't think so. But if we don't push back and say something, and we don't mention it to people who we care about and love, hey, this is happening in America right now, then we do run the risk of this kind of thing just being allowed to go on and on and on. From Visegrad 24, and this is from Friday afternoon, November the 21st. 33-second clip there, reporter. The suggestion you made was that if Zelensky doesn't accept the deal, the U.S. will pull back its support for Ukraine. So this is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Trump, at some point, he's going to have to accept something. In the Oval Office, I said, you don't have all the cards. Excuse me, you don't have the cards. So we know that pressure is building. We've got more to say on this for there to be some kind of a peace arrangement between Russia and Ukraine. And yeah, one of the things which the Trump administration is threatening is to pull military support, pull intelligence support, and Ukraine, you're on your own. Okay, back to the meeting with Mamdani at the Oval Office. This is from Disclosed TV on X. This is from 3:13 p.m. November the 21st, so after Friday's episode. Mamdani, I look forward to rooting out anti-Semitism across the 5 boroughs and protecting Jewish New Yorkers and every New Yorker who calls the city home. Now, this is where we do have to recognize, and this is just politics. This is true of Donald Trump. This is true of Zohran Mamdani. He can't just do things unilaterally on his own. He has to have the approval of the City Assembly of New York. He's got to have the approval of the state government and different funding mechanisms, whether they're from the state of New York or the U.S. federal government. So how many things did Mamdani promise he's not going to be able to fully follow through on? We'll wait and see. Which leads us to this story from the New York Post, November the 21st. Trump says, this is the headline, Trump says he would feel comfortable living in socialist Zohran Mamdani's New York City. President Trump said he would feel at ease living in New York City under Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani after their chummy Oval Office meeting Friday. The president said he and the Democratic Socialist politician agree on a lot more than I would have thought. Okay, I'm not surprised about that, because a lot of what the president, a lot of what we know from Zohran Mamdani, of course, comes from his political campaigning, his political rhetoric, probably, different clips here or there taken of him. Do we have a bigger story? Sometimes that can only come by sitting down with someone, having a friendly exchange, and having more of a big picture view of their worldview. And Zohran Mamdani's jurisdiction is the city of New York. It's not the state of New York. It's certainly not the United States of America. So, of course, President Trump is a very rich man. He's a billionaire. He's probably going to feel a lot more comfortable living in New York or going to visit New York for extended periods than a lot of normal middle-class Americans. All right, here's a post from social media on what took place at Park East Synagogue. I recommend you watch it, listen to it. I sent it to a number of Messianic Jewish friends of mine. It's from Ari Acker, where he says, spare me any of the BS that last night's, so this would have been posted on Thursday, 3 days ago, according to Instagram, disgusting protest was about Israel or Gaza. A synagogue whose rabbi is a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor was viciously targeted. People outside were calling for his death, Israel's death, and a global intifada, meaning a death to Jews worldwide. It was pure, nasty, and dangerous Jewish hatred. Jews will not back down. We will not just go away, but no more silence. We need the good people that see this evil to speak up now for the Jewish community. Amen to that. And of course, that is one of the main reasons why this year, 2025, we started doing this theology and news roundup format. Subsequent to Passover, we went 5 times a week, theology news roundup. These are the kinds of things people in the Messianic sphere of influence definitely need to know about. Okay, from My Charisma, the 21st of November. Why the coming wave of UFO disclosure fits biblical prophecy. So here's another article talking about UFO disclosure, some of the things being discussed in the mainstream media. Here, discussion about whether or not the United States is engaged in a secret technological race with China and Russia to reverse engineer craft of non-human origin. Just all this kind of discussion. And Right. This is kind of a recapitulation of things we have talked about before. But, we take note of this. Charisma definitely likes to pick this up, whether it's to actually help people or for clicks, I don't know. But it definitely be tied into Genesis 6 Nephilim factors. But even without that as a factor, a lot of us want to know about the final frontier. Is humankind the only sentient life in the universe? And different Christian venues will certainly permit that kind of discussion to go on. And as I've also talked about, there is a growing field of theology, often known as exotheology, astrotheology, which, at least hypothetically, what would happen if human beings are not the only civilization in the cosmos? What would that do to your understanding of God, the Bible, Jesus, the gospel, etc.? So we do want to mention these things because they're probably going to be impacting the end time scenario. All right, from the 21st of November, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene to resign. Breaking: Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene announced Friday night she is resigning from Congress on January the 5th, 2026. Now, she, of course, has been a strong supporter of Donald Trump, but in recent days, they have gone sideways. She's also been a strong critic of Israel and not really a friend of Israel or the Jewish people. And she appears to be going in a direction not quite dissimilar from Thomas Massey, as well as not being too much of a friend of Israel. So we'll see what happens with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Haven't really gotten into Marjorie Taylor Greene or Thomas Massey that much. All right, so here's another story. This is from the New York Post, the 22nd of November. So this would have been on Saturday. President George H.W. Bush, so that's the first President Bush, knew of 1964 alien contact with humans in New Mexico. Documentary. Just then, the truth is out there, and late President George H.W. Bush apparently knew it, telling a federal official that an alien made contact with humans at a secretive New Mexico air base in 1964, according to testimony in an explosive new documentary. Okay, I have not seen this documentary, but from the headlines, it's saying that George Bush Sr. knew about some kind of alien contact. We'll see what people are saying about this and other apparent things like this. We don't know. All right, here's another clip. This came across my feed on X. It's from November the 22nd, so Saturday, 12:32 a.m. It's 1 minute, 37 seconds. And here, just like with what appeared at Union Station in Washington, this is also in Washington, so you have somebody dressed up as Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's walking these different politicians. It's the same politicians around as though they are dogs. Bibi Netanyahu takes his lap dogs for a walk. So this is another. Now, these people have free speech, mind you, in America, so technically they can do this. But guess what? Guess who else has free speech? People who find this offensive and say, no, Israel is not running the U.S. government or U.S. foreign policy. Remember what took place during the 12-day war. All America did was go in with its bunker busters, the B-1s, and take out the Iranian nuclear program. There were no U.S. troops, U.S. boots on the ground, and we certainly didn't let it go beyond any kind of a conventional conflict. What the U.S. did just decisively ended it. Was that because Netanyahu is really controlling U.S. foreign policy, or because the U.S. knows that Iran getting a nuclear weapon is a bad thing, and we have the means to just immediately take it out and end it rather than there being some kind of protracted conflict? All right, so here's a very useful post. You can read this later in its entirety. It's from B.A. Pirtle on X. Men who claim that the future salvation and restoration of Israel are theological novelties stemming from Darby, just John Nelson Darby, the Schofield Bible, 19th and 20th century Zionist movements, or Hal Lindsey and Left Behind novels simply don't know their history. I would argue, of course, along with many godly men throughout the centuries, that they don't know their Bibles either, at least not on this matter. Consider this. And here he quotes from John Owen, 1616 to 1683, who anticipates a great restoration of Israel in the end times. Of course, that doesn't always mean that all the details are going to be the same, but this idea that God is completely finished with Israel, the Jewish people, he's completely finished with his plan to restore Israel, that is not something which is accurate, and you've got people going back a lot further than the 20th century, even the 19th century, supporting some kind of futuristic restoration of Israel. Okay, here's another story. This involves, and we referred to this on Friday, our episode on Friday, the proposed peace plan of the United States regarding Russia, Ukraine. You've seen the 28 points. Okay, Visegrad 24. This was from November the 22nd, so this would have been Saturday. Breaking: European leaders plus Canada and Japan issue a joint statement at the G20, which was in Johannesburg, South Africa, on the 28-point peace plan. They welcome U.S. efforts to restart negotiations, but say the draft needs additional work and voice concern about recognizing territorial changes and limits on Ukraine armed forces. They also say that any elements relating to the EU and NATO will need the consent of EU and NATO members, respectively. So you can look at this in its entirety. The question is, as they go back and forth, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, what's going to happen with the EU and NATO, and will European and NATO demands, requirements, whatever you want to call it, will they slow this peace process down? And will we just go back to where we were? You know, this war of attrition back and forth, not too dissimilar from World War I trench fighting, although it's not. But that kind of, they've pretty much figured out how far they can get, how far they can go. We're just going to see more and more young Ukrainians and young Russians perish in this. So there's going to be some more to see and some more to evaluate. Okay, back to theology. This came across my feed on X, and in our growing day of anti-Semitism, you're doubtlessly going to see Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, the synagogue of Satan, invoked. So this is from Reverend Jordan Wells. We've mentioned some of his posts before. No, the Bible does not call Jews the synagogue of Satan. Now listen to this. He says, Revelation 2:9 and 3:9 is Jesus calling out a specific group of first century Jews who were persecuting Christians and rejecting the Messiah, not a green light to hate Jewish people today. Twisting it into all Jews are Satan is straight up anti-Semitic garbage. Amen to that. If you're posting that trash in 2025, congrats. You're doing exactly what the actual synagogue of Satan did, slandering God's covenant people. Stop it, repent, delete the meme. Real Christians bless Israel, not curse it. Yes, and of course, the big question regarding Revelation 2:9 and 3:9 and the synagogue of Satan, because the Messianic community, I hate to say it, does not handle this passage very well, because you got to get into what different commentators have said regarding it, a history of interpretation, and most especially, you got to get into the martyrdom of Polycarp, because one of the factors which causes interpreters to conclude that there's a specific group of ancient Jews targeted here, not all Jews for all time, is that the Jews in Smyrna assisted with the death of Polycarp. And that is an historical factor which you're not going to hear about that frequently in Messianic Jewish examination. Messianic Jewish examination is going to frequently conclude that those who say they are Jews but are not, but a synagogue of Satan, that is actually non-Jewish people, Gentiles who are claiming to be Jewish but are not. And it just kind of leaves out the whole issue of the martyrdom of Polycarp. Now, Reverend Jordan Wells, who has formal theological training, has probably looked through a lot of Revelation commentaries, resources on this, the same as I have. We have an FAQ listed, FAQ tab 2, volume 2, Synagogue of Satan. You can go look it up. It's not speaking of all Jews everywhere at all times. It's targeted to a specific group in Smyrna and also Philadelphia that opposed the believers. And you have to remember, Yeshua perhaps telling a small, limited group of ancient Jews, you say you are Jews, you're not, you're a synagogue of Satan. That is quantitatively indifferent from God himself in Hosea calling his people not a people. You're not my own. That is quantitatively indifferent. Yet there are promises, as seen throughout the scriptures, that those who are dismissed from God by God can, of course, be restored to him. So, not sure when we're going to address this topic in specific detail. Okay, we're going to change gears entirely. This is from the Epoch Times, the 22nd of November. This is scientific. Here you see a reference to how the U.S. right now is, of course, having to get a lot of its rare earth minerals from a place like China. This scientist, Dr. James Tour, indicates how in a few years, America may not need to buy rare earths from China anymore, says chemist Dr. James Tour. Why? Because he and his team have pioneered an incredible process to quickly extract rare earths from things we have abundantly available, electronic waste and industrial waste. So here, especially, and you see images of like all these old computers, all these old circuit boards, that sort of thing. We've got all of these rare earth minerals apparently in all of these things which have been thrown away. You know, your old phone, your old 286 or 386, which is in some landfill someplace. We can apparently, using his process, extract those rare earth minerals from things we already have in abundance. I mean, how many of us, this year, as the holiday season comes, we're going to throw away an old TV. We're going to throw away an old computer. We're going to throw away something that doesn't work. There are things which can be extracted from that and then recycled, apparently. I'm not a metallurgist, so I don't know, or a chemist, so I don't know the specific process, but it sounds intriguing. All right, so this is from Visegrad 24. This was posted November the 23rd, yesterday afternoon. You can look at this in greater detail. The Telegraph leaks what they claim to be Europe's 24-point peace plan. Here are the key points. So here you see, and we're not going to go through all of them. Number 9, Ukraine's sovereignty is respected and reconfirmed. Ukraine is not forced to become neutral. 13, Ukraine's membership in NATO depends on consensus within the alliance. 16, territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. Things like this. So, yeah, we're going to just see what happens with Russia, Ukraine. But I know that at the end of last week, we were hearing things like, this could be resolved by the weekend. This could be resolved by Thanksgiving, by the end of the month. I'm doubtful of that. Okay, over the weekend in Israel, this is from Open Source Intel with a 1-minute 45-second clip from Netanyahu speaking in English. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a statement to the media, I'm sorry, I may not have been speaking English. Take that back. Several hours ago, the IDF eliminated Ali Tabatabai, the chief of staff of the Hezbollah terrorist organization. Tabatabai was a mass murderer. His hands were stained with the blood of many Israelis and Americans, and not without reason. The United States offered a $5 million reward for his head. Okay, so obviously, if the U.S. government was after this SOB, then the Israeli government, in their mind, fully justified to take him out. All right, this is from yesterday, open source intel at 2:37 p.m. U.S. and Ukrainian officials are discussing the potential of bringing President Vladimir Zelensky to the U.S. this week as part of President Trump's push to get an agreement on Ukraine by Thanksgiving, CBS News. Okay, is it going to happen by Thanksgiving? I don't know. Okay, we got 9 more to go through. From the Telegraph, and this is from yesterday at 12:16 p.m., so yesterday afternoon, new Europe has offered to invite Vladimir Putin back into the G8 as part of a peace deal for Ukraine. Okay, how much of this is realistic? How much of this is just rumor, innuendo, negotiating tactic? Okay. This is a kerfuffle from over the weekend regarding the Trump administration's peace proposals regarding Russia, Ukraine. Rubio, Witkoff, that's Steve Witkoff, scrambled to get Ukraine peace plan back on track after blowback and claims it came from Russia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff scrambled on November the 23rd to get the White House's controversial 28-point Ukraine peace plan back on track after facing bipartisan criticisms that it was nothing more than a Russian wish list. And that came from how certain clauses, certain statements appearing in the 28 points seemed very odd to an English reader, but in Russian they make a lot more sense. So this is all part of the back and forth. Russia, Ukraine, United States, European Union, and NATO. Here's a story from Breitbart yesterday, the 23rd of November. Former Zelensky press secretary calls for Ukraine to take peace deal. Ukraine is bleeding out. Yulia Mendel, a former press secretary for Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, called for Ukraine to take a proposed peace deal to end the war with Russia. In a post on X, Mendel expressed that her country is bleeding out. Mendel explained that while people who reflexively oppose every peace proposal believe they are doing the right thing, it is proof they have no idea what is actually happening on the front lines. Every subsequent deal for Ukraine will only be worse because we are losing, Mendel wrote. We are losing people, territory, and the economy. Okay, that is her opinion. And we want to note what that opinion is because sooner or later, excuse me, something is going to have to happen in the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine cannot fight down to the last proverbial man. It can't. Okay? And yes, this is end time wars and rumors of wars. Okay, now back to the whole G8, Russia being invited back in, open source intel. This morning at 3:07 a.m., Germany and France opposed Russia rejoining the G8 under the proposed U.S. peace plan for Ukraine. Chancellor Merz said, "At the moment, I do not see any willingness among the 6 current G7 members to readmit Russia, with Macron sharing the same stance. Russia was expelled from the G8 in 2014 over Crimea." Okay, now here's a story which probably many of us are going to find rather disturbing, but we're just going to pass this on. Not a lot of news outlets I saw picked it up. Open source intel today, 4:14 a.m. The U.S. Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, launched under Trump to cut government size, has been disbanded 8 months before its mandate ended. Yeah, that's upsetting to me. How much were they actually able to legitimately do? Okay, we got 4 more. From Visegrad 24, and this is from 7:10 a.m. today. Ukraine has outlined its red lines in peace negotiations after reviewing the U.S. peace plan. So I'm going to mispronounce this probably. Verkhovna Rada Speaker Ruslan Stefanchuk specified Ukraine's non-negotiable points. Any restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces are unacceptable. Ukraine cannot be limited in its right to join alliances. The country will not recognize the loss of its territories. Ukraine's NATO and EU accession must be part of future security guarantees. Okay. Yeah, that's not a huge surprise. But what is Ukraine going to be able to realistically do? That's what others are saying. Okay. To the Western Hemisphere, once again, Visegrad 24, 7:55 a.m. The U.S. has officially designated Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro as a member of a foreign terrorist organization. This move enables additional sanctions on the regime's assets and logistical networks. Washington expects that the heightened pressure will encourage Maduro to step down and provide the U.S. with greater leverage in the region, according to CNN. Okay, so what is going to happen in the coming days with the Venezuelan situation? We got another story passed on from open source intel today. This is from 7:53 a.m. and there's a 48-second clip from Fox News. U.S. military surge to push Russia, China, and Iran out of the Americas. Fox News is reporting that the sweeping U.S. buildup in our own hemisphere shows this is about far more than Maduro. It's about getting Russia, China, and Iran out of the Western Hemisphere. Should President Trump order strikes against the Maduro regime, about 30% of all deployed American warships, including Gerald R. Ford, now on station. Okay, so we do have the Thanksgiving holiday coming up. I did see, even though I didn't add it to the list, I did see some stories about how a number of U.S. servicemen and servicewomen should not expect the same kind of Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays as they've had in the past. There are probably going to be some restrictions on them, how far they can go and everything else. Of course, that's subject to change. But if they're talking about it's not going to be a Thanksgiving or Christmas as normal for servicemen and women, what that means is that we need to be paying attention to this kind of a potential conflict. That's what it means. Okay, and our last story, let's go to China. Okay, this was from 9:29 a.m. this morning, and this is Visegrad 24 passing a few things along. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump had held a phone call. This was reported by Xinhua. I probably mispronounced that. The topic of the discussion was unclear, and the readout did not provide any additional details, although I do believe the White House has posted some more on that. But here, the main thing being talked about is during the phone call between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, the issue of Taiwan was raised. Xi stated that Taiwan's return to China is an important part of the post-war international order. And of course, we also know that China and Japan have had some disagreements recently. And how does that possibly play into this? Hard to tell right now. But, of course, we know that the Lord is in complete control. We have a responsibility as his people to be paying attention to the changes in our world. And that is why we have not only the theology roundup, but also the news roundup. Because a lot of the stories we do go through, they're out there. They are public. We're not going to the alt-right or the alt-left. We're going, from pretty middle of the road. That's why I like, open source intel so much, because, we're not going on rumor or innuendo. These are things out there which we can pay attention to in real time. We have to, of course, evaluate them, file them away, factor them away. But we're living in a rapidly changing world. And just look at all the variety of topics we've addressed in the news roundup today. Everything from Park East Synagogue, what took place at DC Union Station, Zohran Mamdani, UFOs, Marjorie Taylor Greene, President Bush Sr. knowing apparently about alien contact back in 1964. We discussed the Synagogue of Satan. We talked about the Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations back and forth. And of course, leader of Hezbollah taken out, and the Venezuela situation, the China situation. Just look at that variety of stories. Now, of course, they change every day. And Monday, we tend to address more because we are getting caught up from the weekend. But I hope that this is something you all find useful, you find it beneficial, and it keeps you up to speed, because you, as a believer, a Messianic man or woman, have to offer frequently comfort, solace to people who are very confused and very much afraid. All right. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. If you have not, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can access a wide array of free articles, frequently asked questions entries. You can check out some back issues of Outreach Israel News. Look up some back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, etc. And please, if you have not already, be sure to give this episode a thumbs up or a heart, as it will help its exposure on social media. We will see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.